The history we forgot still shapes the world we live in. History is not just what we remember, it's also what we forget. When we think of the 20th century, our minds leap to the thunder of two world wars, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and the televised tremors of Vietnam. These grand narratives dominate the textbooks, documentaries, and national memory. But beneath the headlines are conflicts lost to time, battles buried by politics, indifference, or the victor's pens. Yet these forgotten wars were no less brutal, no less transformative. They shaped borders, birthed revolutions, shattered empires, and defined the very ideologies that governed the rest of the century. Men died in jungles no one speaks of. Cities burned in places we never learned to pronounce. Flags rose and fell. Entire generations vanished into the footnotes of someone else's story. This video is about those stories, the overlooked conflicts that rewrote the 20th century from behind the curtain. Some of them lit the fuse to much larger wars. Others quietly redrew the world map or planted the seeds of rebellion, dictatorship, or global unrest. To forget them is to misunderstand the world we live in. Join us as we uncover 9 forgotten conflicts that shaped everything from world wars to modern borders, and yet remain hauntingly absent from most classroom walls. By the end, you'll realize that the 20th century's greatest transformations didn't always start on the front pages. In the grand sweep of 20th century history, the Italo-Turkish War is often reduced to a minor footnote. But behind its obscure title lies a conflict that previewed the world wars to come, exposed the fragility of empires, and introduced the deadly innovations of modern warfare. Long forgotten by many, this war helped ignite a domino effect that would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkan Wars, and even the First World War itself. By the early 1900s, Italy was desperate to establish itself as a true imperial power, eager to catch up with Britain, France, and Germany. It had watched its European neighbors carve up Africa and Asia and wanted its piece of the global pie. The aging and crumbling Ottoman Empire, often called the sick man of Europe, offered a tempting target. In particular, Italy set its sights on Libya, then an Ottoman province. Though sparsely populated, Libya's strategic position along the Mediterranean made it a valuable prize and potential launchpad for further expansion in North Africa. In September 1911, using a flimsy pretext about the safety of Italian citizens, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire and launched a naval invasion of Tripoli. What it thought would be a swift colonial campaign turned into a prolonged and bitter conflict. The Italo-Turkish War was short, but it changed the game in several ways. Most notably, it became the first war in history to use airplanes in combat. Italy conducted aerial reconnaissance and bombing runs, introducing air power as a military strategy, something that would define future warfare. The Ottomans responded with guerrilla resistance, often blending into the local population. This forced Italian troops into brutal desert warfare and provoked severe reprisals against civilians. The conflict also saw the use of motorized vehicles, wireless communication, and new naval tactics, making it a testing ground for the technological tools that would dominate World War I just a few years later. Though Italy eventually claimed victory and annexed Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, which is modern-day Libya, the war's true impact was felt far beyond North Africa. The Ottoman Empire's weak performance in the war exposed its vulnerability to other nations. Sensing blood in the water, the Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, formed an alliance and launched the First Balkan War in 1912, hoping to seize territory from the Ottomans in Europe. That war and the Second Balkan War that followed destabilized the region and set the stage for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, the spark that ignited World War I. In this way, the Italo-Turkish War served as a prelude to the century's defining global conflicts. So why isn't the Italo-Turkish War more widely remembered? To begin with, it was overshadowed almost immediately by larger events such as the Balkan Wars and the Great War. Italy's colonial ambitions paled in comparison to the more dramatic campaigns of Britain or France, and Libya was considered a backwater compared to the industrial centers of Europe. Yet the impact of this war was profound. It was the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire, a milestone in military innovation, and an important link in the chain that led the world to all-out war. Forgotten by many, the Italo-Turkish War quietly rewrote history before anyone realized the ink was dry. In the sun-scorched mountains of northern Morocco, a little-known guerrilla war shook the foundations of European colonialism. The Rif War, fought between Berber tribes of the Rif region and the combined forces of Spain and France, is often overlooked, but it was one of the most influential anti-colonial revolts of the 20th century. Led by a charismatic and brilliant leader, Abd el-Krim, this was no ordinary rebellion. It was a full-scale war of resistance, and for several years the tribal fighters of the Rif did what few believed possible. They defeated European armies, embarrassed global powers, and inspired independence movements across the colonized world. After the partition of Morocco in 1912, Spain controlled the northern part of the country, including the rugged Rif Mountains. Spanish authorities, eager to exploit the region's minerals, imposed harsh rule, heavy taxation, and military occupation, with little regard for local tribes. The Berber people, fiercely independent and familiar with the terrain, resented the intrusion. Under Abd el-Krim's leadership, a former civil servant turned revolutionary, they united against Spanish expansion. In 1921, their forces ambushed a Spanish outpost in Annual, routing over 13,000 Spanish troops in a single catastrophic defeat. The loss stunned Europe and marked one of the worst colonial military disasters in modern history. The Rif War wasn't just a local uprising, it was a challenge to colonialism itself. Abd el-Krim didn't just fight for tribal autonomy. He declared the Republic of the Rif, a short-lived but bold attempt to build a modern, self-governed Muslim state free from European authority. His forces relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, mobility, and deep knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver conventional armies. They fought with passion and precision, even while outgunned. The effectiveness of these tactics forced both Spain and France to send tens of thousands of troops, including foreign legionnaires, tanks, and aircraft. The French, concerned the rebellion might spread to their own North African territories, joined Spain in a brutal joint campaign. By 1926, the Rif Republic was crushed. Abd el-Krim surrendered and was exiled, but the symbol of resistance lived on. Despite its importance, the Rif War is barely remembered today outside Morocco. Yet it had far-reaching consequences, as when European forces used widespread aerial bombardment and chemical weapons against civilian populations. It had psychological impact by revealing the vulnerability of colonial forces. The Rif War had anti-colonial inspiration, as people like Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Frantz Fanon considered it a strong example of successful native resistance. The Rif War was forgotten because it was inconvenient for imperial powers. Spain and France had little interest in celebrating a conflict where they were initially humiliated by tribal fighters. And in the broader context of rising fascism, global depression, and approaching world wars, the story of the Rif faded into the shadows. Tucked away in the heart of South America, between the dry brushlands of Bolivia and Paraguay, raged a brutal and largely forgotten war that claimed more lives than any other conflict on the continent in the 20th century. The Chaco War, fought from 1932 to 1935, was devastating, deeply political, and for a time shockingly modern. Though overshadowed by global wars in Europe and Asia, this bloody fight over a patch of seemingly worthless land would reshape national identities, foreign influence in Latin America, and the myth of oil-fueled conflict that would define international relations for decades. The Gran Chaco Boreal is a remote, arid lowland stretching between Paraguay and Bolivia. For years, both nations claimed ownership of it, largely due to vague colonial-era boundaries. Neither country had seriously attempted to develop the region, until rumors began to swirl that oil might lie beneath the Chaco's dusty soil. Enter foreign corporations. Bolivia had ties to Standard Oil, while Paraguay was aligned with Royal Dutch Shell. Though neither company played a direct role in the war, their perceived influence added fuel to nationalist rhetoric and gave the war an ominous nickname: South America's First Oil War. At the time, Bolivia was landlocked, having lost its coastline to Chile in the War of the Pacific in the late 19th century. Gaining control of the Chaco and access to the Paraguay River was seen as a strategic redemption, a gateway to the Atlantic. In 1932, after years of border skirmishes and militarization, war erupted. Despite the desolate terrain, the Chaco War was anything but small. It became one of the deadliest conflicts in Latin American history, with estimated casualties ranging from 80,000 to 100,000. Both sides mobilized tens of thousands of troops and modern weapons, turning the conflict into a full-scale industrial war. Soldiers endured extreme heat, dehydration, disease, and poor supply lines. Many died not from combat, but from malaria, dysentery, or sheer exhaustion. What made the war even more tragic was its brutality and futility. Much of the fighting occurred in lifeless scrubland, and the oil reserves both nations so desperately sought were never found in meaningful quantities. Early in the war, Bolivia seemed poised to win. It had the larger army, better equipment, and more financial resources. But Paraguay had what Bolivia didn't: home field advantage, effective leadership, and national unity. Led by General José Félix Estigarribia, Paraguay's forces used superior knowledge of the terrain and clever tactics to wear down the Bolivian military. Morale among Bolivian troops, many of whom were indigenous conscripts with no investment in the conflict, crumbled. By the end of the war in 1935, Paraguay had seized most of the Chaco. A ceasefire was declared, and a peace treaty signed in 1938 granted Paraguay control over three-quarters of the disputed region. The Chaco War was largely forgotten because it didn't involve the great powers of Europe or Asia. It didn't lead to global treaties or dramatic ideological shifts. The years following World War I were supposed to bring peace to Europe and the Middle East. Instead, they birthed a brutal war between two ancient civilizations, driven by revenge, nationalism, and the collapse of empires. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 is one of the most important yet overlooked conflicts of the 20th century. It not only marked the end of the Ottoman Empire, it also reshaped the identities of both Greece and Turkey forever. What began as a bold land grab by a victorious ally ended in flames, exodus, and the largest forced population exchange in modern European history. In the aftermath of World War I, the defeated Ottoman Empire was carved up by the victorious Allied powers. The Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, proposed dismembering Turkish lands, awarding key regions to Greece, Armenia, and European powers. Encouraged by British support and its own historic claims to Anatolia, Greece invaded Asia Minor in 1919, aiming to reclaim ancient territories and realize the dream of a Greater Greece. The Greek army quickly occupied Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, and advanced inland, expecting minimal resistance from a defeated empire. But the Ottomans were not finished. In the heart of Anatolia, a new Turkish nationalist movement was gathering momentum, led by a former general named Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rejected the Allied-imposed Treaty of Sèvres and rallied support for a new Turkish republic, free from foreign occupation. From 1920 to 1922, Kemal's forces built a disciplined, determined army. When Greece attempted to seize Ankara in 1921, Turkish resistance stiffened. The tide turned in 1922 when Turkish forces launched a counteroffensive, driving Greek troops westward in a rapid and devastating retreat. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced the earlier, rejected Treaty of Sèvres. It recognized the sovereignty of the new Republic of Turkey and effectively ended the Ottoman Empire. But its most profound consequence was a massive population exchange, as 1.5 million Greeks were expelled from Turkey and 500,000 Muslims were expelled from Greece. Families were uprooted, properties lost, and centuries-old communities shattered. This exchange marked one of the first attempts at state-sanctioned ethnic unmixing in modern history, a grim model that would be echoed in later conflicts across the Balkans and beyond. The Greco-Turkish War is remembered vividly in Greece and Turkey, but elsewhere it is often overshadowed by World War I and II. Its complexities, ethnic cleansing, nationalism, Western interference, don't fit neatly into textbook narratives. Yet it ended one empire and created a modern nation-state. It forged Ataturk's legacy as the founder of secular Turkey, and it left deep wounds that still affect Greek-Turkish relations and regional geopolitics. The Greco-Turkish War wasn't just a clash over territory. It was a war over who belonged where. It violently erased multicultural coexistence in the region, and set the tone for ethnic nationalism as a dominant force in the 20th century. For millions, it was not just forgotten history. It was the day everything they knew was lost. Long before the Cold War, long before Vietnam or Iraq, the United States waged a series of small wars across the Caribbean and Central America that shaped modern imperial strategy, but rarely make it into history books. These conflicts, collectively known as the Banana Wars, were a series of military interventions, occupations, and political manipulations carried out by the U.S. to protect its economic interests and assert dominance in the Western Hemisphere. While officially justified as efforts to stabilize unruly nations or protect American lives, these wars were often driven by the interests of corporations like the United Fruit Company and helped entrench authoritarian regimes, economic inequality, and decades of instability in the region. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 had long warned European powers to stay out of the Americas. But by the late 19th century, that doctrine evolved into a tool for American interventionism. The U.S. justified direct interference in the affairs of smaller Latin American nations under the guise of promoting order and protecting democracy. In truth, the U.S. was increasingly acting to protect its economic investments, particularly in the banana, sugar, and mining industries. From 1898 to 1934, U.S. Marines landed in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Panama, often staying for years and reshaping the political landscape to suit American interests. These conflicts weren't wars in the traditional sense, but rather long-term military occupations and low-intensity battles that blurred the lines between imperial policing and outright conquest. The Banana Wars were deeply intertwined with the rise of banana republics, nations whose political systems were manipulated or controlled to serve the interests of U.S.-based corporations, especially the United Fruit Company. The U.S. State Department, under policies like dollar diplomacy and later gunboat diplomacy, often intervened militarily to protect American companies from labor strikes, nationalization threats, or political instability, even if it meant undermining local democracy. This practice created resentment across Latin America, fueled revolutionary movements, and left behind corrupt political structures that persisted long after U.S. troops departed. They established the U.S. as a hemispheric power, willing to use military force to shape Latin America. They normalized the use of Marines in covert operations to enforce foreign policy. They helped sow the seeds of anti-Americanism in the region, which would erupt in later decades during the Cold War. Unlike the World Wars, the Banana Wars were forgotten because they lacked large-scale battles or dramatic victories. They were messy, drawn-out affairs with uncomfortable motivations and morally questionable outcomes. The American public, increasingly focused on Europe and Asia, saw little glory in these imperial entanglements. As a result, this chapter of U.S. history was downplayed or ignored, despite its profound influence on foreign policy, military doctrine, and Latin American development. In the chaotic aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution, two emerging nations, Poland and Soviet Russia, clashed in a war that could have altered the fate of Europe. The Soviet-Polish War that took place from 1919 to 1921 is rarely mentioned in mainstream histories, yet it was a crucial conflict that shaped borders, halted the westward spread of communism, and helped define the political landscape of Eastern Europe for decades. Had it ended differently, the red flag of the Bolsheviks might have flown over Berlin, and the course of the 20th century could have looked very different. The war was born from overlapping ambitions. Poland, having just regained independence after 123 years of partition by neighboring empires, sought to restore its pre-partition borders and emerge as a major power in Eastern Europe. Its leader, Józef Piłsudski, envisioned a federation of Central and Eastern European states led by Poland to act as a buffer against both Germany and Russia. Meanwhile, Lenin's Soviet Russia was determined to spread communist revolution westward. After consolidating power in Moscow and repelling anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War, Lenin viewed Poland as a gateway to spreading communism into Germany, where socialist uprisings were already simmering. As both nations pushed their boundaries into the void left by the collapse of empires, conflict was inevitable. Fighting broke out in early 1919 as skirmishes along the fluid border escalated into full-scale war. Poland initially gained ground, capturing Kiev in 1920. But the Red Army, led by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, launched a massive counteroffensive and pushed rapidly westward, threatening Warsaw itself. European observers braced for disaster. If Warsaw fell, the Bolsheviks could advance into Germany and possibly trigger a continent-wide revolution. Then came the dramatic reversal known as the Miracle on the Vistula. In August 1920, Polish forces, under Pilsudski's leadership, mounted a surprise counterattack and decisively defeated the Red Army near Warsaw. The Soviets retreated in disarray. By March 1921, the Treaty of Riga was signed. It granted Poland large swaths of contested territory in Ukraine and Belarus, but also halted Soviet momentum into Western Europe. The Soviet-Polish War arguably stopped the spread of Bolshevism into Central Europe. If the Red Army had succeeded, Germany's fragile democracy could have fallen to communism before the Nazis ever rose. Poland's eastern border moved far beyond its current limits, incorporating millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews, creating long-standing ethnic tensions. The defeat was humiliating for the Soviets. Stalin, who participated in the war, never forgot the loss. When the USSR invaded Poland in 1939 alongside Nazi Germany, it was seen as long-awaited revenge. The Soviet-Polish War is often forgotten because it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of World War I or II. It was sandwiched between two global conflicts and involved nations often left out of Western histories. Moreover, after World War II, the new Soviet-controlled Polish government had no interest in celebrating a war in which Polish nationalists defeated the USSR. The topic became politically sensitive and was largely erased from school curricula in Eastern Bloc countries. In the early days of 1918, as the world reeled from the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Empire lay shattered by revolution, a small nation in the far north became a battleground between two ideologies. The Finnish Civil War, a short, intense, and often forgotten conflict, wasn't just a local struggle for power. It was a microcosm of the global war between socialism and conservatism that would define much of the 20th century. Though overshadowed by the wars of larger nations, Finland's civil war left deep scars on its people and set the stage for its precarious balancing act between East and West for the next 100 years. Finland had long been an autonomous Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire, but after the Russian Revolution of 1917, Finland seized the moment and declared independence. The power vacuum left behind was immense and dangerously unstable. Society was deeply polarized. On one side were the Reds, composed of workers, tenant farmers, and socialists, who were inspired by the Bolsheviks' success and wanted radical reform. On the other side were the Whites, made up of landowners, the bourgeoisie, conservatives, and nationalists, who sought to maintain traditional order and establish an independent, Western-aligned state. What began as a political struggle quickly erupted into civil war in January 1918. The war lasted just over 3 months, but its violence was shocking. The Reds, based in southern industrial centers like Helsinki and Tampere, formed militias with help from Russian Bolsheviks. The Whites, based in the rural north, were led by General Karl Gustav Emil Mannerheim and received military support from Germany. By May 1918, the Whites had achieved victory, with German troops playing a decisive role in crushing the final Red strongholds. The White victory secured Finland's independence, but at a steep cost. Over 36,000 people died, many in post-war purges or in camps. The trauma left the country bitterly divided for generations. In the years that followed, Reds were marginalized, with many leaders executed or exiled. Overall, political life became fragile and tense. The fear of renewed revolution pushed Finland toward conservatism and later complicated its stance during World War II, where it fought the Soviet Union while trying to maintain its independence. Despite the violence, Finland eventually evolved into a stable democracy, though one always mindful of its geographic and political proximity to Russia. Unlike larger European conflicts, the Finnish Civil War had no clear ideological winner on the global stage. It ended before most Western nations had fully grasped the rise of Bolshevism, and after World War I began dominating political attention. For decades, the wounds were too fresh for Finns to speak openly about the war. The Red side in particular was written out of mainstream history until the late 20th century. Internationally, it became a historical footnote, an early skirmish in what would later become the Cold War. The Finnish Civil War showed how ideology can tear a young nation apart and how the choices made in those early moments can echo for generations. It was one of the first violent clashes between communism and anti-communism, a prototype of the ideological battles that would define the century. And it reminds us that even the quietest countries have fought hard for the peace they now enjoy. Before the world turned its attention to World War II, a fierce and violent uprising erupted in British-controlled Palestine, one that would plant the seeds for one of the world's most enduring conflicts. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 is often lost in the shadows of larger global wars. Yet it was a pivotal moment in Middle Eastern history. This forgotten rebellion against British rule and rising Jewish immigration laid the groundwork for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that continues to this day. It was not just an anti-colonial revolt, it was a crisis of identity, belonging, and broken promises. After World War I, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, having promised both Arabs and Jews contradictory visions of self-determination. To Arab Palestinians, the land was theirs by right and history. To Jews, it was their ancient homeland. And the Balfour Declaration of 1917 had endorsed the creation of a national home for the Jewish people there. By the 1930s, waves of Jewish immigrants fleeing European anti-Semitism arrived in Palestine, buying land and building new settlements. Arab Palestinians saw this as a growing threat to their land, labor rights, and national identity. When the Great Depression hit and economic instability rose, so did tensions. In April 1936, a general strike and protests quickly escalated into a full-scale revolt. The Arab Revolt had two phases. Phase 1, which took place from 1936 through 1937, began with a 6-month general strike, one of the longest in modern history. There were coordinated boycotts of British goods, attacks on railway lines, roads, and police stations. It was initially driven by popular protests and rural insurgents, especially in northern Palestine. Britain responded with a harsh crackdown, sending thousands of troops and arresting Palestinian leaders. Phase 2, which took place from 1937 through 1939, was sparked after Britain banned the Arab Hire Committee, causing the revolt to become more militarized. Guerrilla warfare was intensified in rural areas. Britain deployed up to 30,000 troops, imposed collective punishments, demolished homes, and conducted mass arrests and executions. By the end of the revolt, over 5,000 Palestinians had been killed, tens of thousands wounded, and hundreds of villages severely damaged. The Arab Revolt failed militarily, but it reshaped the political terrain in Palestine and the broader Middle East because the Palestinian nationalist leadership was decimated, leaving the population disorganized and vulnerable in the years leading up to 1948. The Arab Revolt was overshadowed by the outbreak of World War II. Western media and historians often viewed it through a colonial lens, dismissing it as disorder rather than a genuine nationalist movement. When people think of World War II, they often start in 1939, with Hitler's invasion of Poland and the eruption of war in Europe. But in East Asia, the conflict had already begun 2 years earlier, in a devastating clash between Japan and China that would become one of the deadliest wars in human history. The Second Sino-Japanese War is often treated as a regional precursor to World War II, but it wasn't. It was a full-scale, brutal, and globally significant conflict in its own right. With over 20 million deaths, mass atrocities, and a decisive impact on the world order, this war reshaped Asia, exposed the horrors of imperialism, and helped pave the way for both the Cold War and modern China's rise. In the early 20th century, Japan had emerged as an imperial powerhouse, defeating both China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, and establishing control over Taiwan, Korea, and parts of Manchuria. By the 1930s, Japan's militarist government was eager to expand further and saw China's political instability as an opportunity. Meanwhile, China was fractured, torn between the ruling Nationalist Party, Kuomintang or KMT under Chiang Kai-shek, and the rising Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria and creation of the puppet state Manchukuo had already ignited conflict. But it was the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, a small skirmish near Beijing, that exploded into all-out war. From 1937 to 1945, the Second Sino-Japanese War engulfed eastern and central China in a relentless tide of violence. Japan's goal was to crush Chinese resistance quickly, but they underestimated the size, resilience, and nationalism of the Chinese people. Here are four key events from this brutal war. The Rape of Nanjing, 1937. Japanese troops committed mass murder, rape, and looting after capturing the Chinese capital. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians were killed in what remains one of the most infamous war crimes of the 20th century. Scorched earth and guerrilla warfare. Chinese forces, though often outgunned, resorted to defensive withdrawals, sabotage, and guerrilla tactics. Entire cities and crops were destroyed to slow Japanese advances. United front between rivals. The nationalists and communists temporarily set aside their civil war to form a fragile, united front against the Japanese, though tensions remained high. Japanese brutality and biological warfare. Japan used chemical and biological weapons, conducted human experimentation, and enforced policies of collective punishment that devastated civilian populations. The Second Sino-Japanese War was not a sideshow. It was intertwined with current global events at the time. For instance, China received aid from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, even before the U.S. officially entered World War II. American pilot volunteers known as the Flying Tigers gained fame defending Chinese skies. Japan's failure to defeat China quickly led it to expand its aggression into Southeast Asia, ultimately provoking conflict with the U.S. and Britain. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was directly connected to Japan's frustration with the U.S. oil embargo, which was imposed due to Japan's invasion of China. Additionally, China tied down over 1 million Japanese troops throughout the war, forces that might otherwise have been used against the Allies elsewhere. In 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings, the war officially ended. But peace in China was short-lived. The fragile alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed into a renewed civil war, which ended in 1949 with the communist victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. In Western histories, the Sino-Japanese War is often treated as a footnote to the European theater of World War II. Its complexity, length, and regional focus led many textbooks to condense or overlook it entirely. But this war was World War II for China. It lasted longer, killed more civilians, and left more lasting trauma than many of the battles fought in Europe. And perhaps most importantly, it shaped the post-war order in Asia. Without it, there would be no Communist China, no Korean War, no Vietnam War, and perhaps no Cold War as we know it. We often measure history by its loudest moments, world wars, revolutions, and televised tragedies. But the truth is, history is more often shaped in silence, in dusty trenches, remote villages, or policy rooms where the world doesn't seem to be watching. Each of the 9 forgotten conflicts we explored in this video was more than just a footnote. They were the scaffolding beneath the visible events of the 20th century. These wars redrew borders, gave birth to nations, crushed old empires, and sparked the ideological battles that still define our politics, our alliances, and our identities. They taught generals how to wage modern war. They taught revolutionaries how to resist. They taught empires what happens when power overreaches and people rise. To forget these stories is to erase the people who fought, died, fled, and rebuilt their lives in their wake. It is to miss the warning signs written in history's margins. As we face new uncertainties in the 21st century, new rivalries, new crises, and new ambitions, remember this. The next global shift may not start with a bang. It may begin quietly in one of history's forgotten corners. So let us remember, not just the wars we were taught to remember, but the ones we weren't.